Hey, welcome to the Unwed Bride. As someone who grew up in the Christian culture and recently achieved the scarlet letter D myself of divorce, I've been questioning many of the things that I grew up being taught. The Unwed Bride is a show where we want to bring light to situations that might be holding us back, challenge any learned behaviors and beliefs, and empower you to make any necessary changes in order to live your life to the fullest. This is the Unwed Bride, where we challenge culture and empower people. What is up? I am Danielle, and this is Dr. Jamie Brodarick. Jamie, go ahead and say hey and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a child of divorce. And both of my parents have been married 3 times, and hence the reason I became a therapist, probably.
Is that true? Do you think that's the reason why?
Absolutely. I knew.
I love that.
In
I didn't
high
know
school.
that about you.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome, man. Even more perfect of a guest to have on here. But Dr. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today. You have definitely been a major sounding board for me, and I'm really, really grateful for you and how much you have helped me. I would not be the person I am today. I would not be in this situation in my life today without you. So thank you.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate you. So, guys, obviously we'll mention divorce today, but that is not what this show is all about. No matter if you are single and dating, married, divorced, or not even looking for a relationship or anything, there's definitely a lot in store for you and a lot that we can all learn together. So, Dr. Jamie, you obviously saw me through my marriage and that whole process. You saw me at my worst and are now seeing me at my best, but we're just going to jump right in. So when you saw me going through all the things with my ex, how would you describe my process of growing to give myself permission?
I would say, like many people I've worked with that are contemplating divorce or just really struggling in their marriage, what grips you so much at first is fear, and it's fear of the unknown and uncertainty. And when you are making fear-based decisions, rarely are those good decisions.
Yeah.
And I think about most people experience a grief process similar to grieving the loss of a loved one, like through death, because it is a death. It's the death of a relationship, of a life you envisioned. And with that comes the 5 stages of grief and loss are, first we have denial, which is this is okay. It can get better. We'll make this work. We can get past this. And then you have anger comes after denial when reality really sets in and you're just really angry and rageful. And sometimes it's at the other person, sometimes it's at God, sometimes it's at the world. And
that's so good.
So watching anger really take shape. Then you go into guilt mode where you feel badly about the choice that you might have to make or the things that you need to do to protect yourself. And following that is usually a period of sadness or depression, which didn't feel like it lasted very long for you once you were able to move through the first 3 stages. I think you kind of jumped a bit into acceptance and where you are now, which is that realization this is what needed to happen and just being okay with. I think your process was so difficult to get to the point where you resolved to make that decision. And then once you made it, it was smoother for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it was going against everything I was taught my entire life, like divorce is not an option, divorce is not an option, divorce is not an option, marriage is a covenant that lasts your entire life. And having to like undo this, like these learned beliefs of this is never an option, that was so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a big part of like, I mean, that's literally how the Unwed Bride was birthed, because God's plan is never for divorce. That is not his heart. But sometimes there's situations where that needs to happen, and there are biblical grounds for it, and that's okay. But that is something that is not talked about. And so that is something that literally birthed this passion of like, if I felt stuck in my marriage for only 3 years, I know that there's other people out there that hate their lives, feel stuck, don't feel like there's any reason that gives them grounds to leave. Like, and so like, it is just to reach those people and give them permission, whether you're dating or not, like whether you're married or not. If you're in a dating relationship, and I mean, I was one in college that, I fought so long for. Just because if you fought so long for it, that's probably a red flag, number one.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't want to give up after all of this work that you have put in.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough.
It is. And giving yourself that permission just even to listen to God. I think that's what I noticed about your process is he was trying to speak to you and reveal yourself, but you it didn't fit with what those ideals were that you had been taught. And so you chose to kind of not listen to your intuition. Yes. That's God-given.
Yes. 100. That's such a good point. And I think that was a big turning point for me of choosing to listen to the Holy Spirit and what he was telling me to do, even though it went against everything I was taught about him for 31 years. That was a mind game for me. Like, okay, truly getting to know you as my Father, the Holy Spirit, all of it, and making that discernment and almost like having that like veil lifted off my eyes of like, wow, maybe some of the things that I was taught my whole life weren't true about you, Father. And that was a really, really big turning point. I think it took that time with the Holy Spirit and learning his voice to give me permission. Like, that's what it took for me to give myself permission. I had to hear his voice first so that I could give myself permission.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy. So as I just mentioned, a college relationship, women are wired for love and affection. And so clearly I have some patterns here that might not make my picker the best picker of men. But since we're wired for love and affection, how do you see this often affecting our decision-making skills?
That is a really great question. And I would say, that women have a tendency to fall in love with potential of a person.
Yes.
And so what could be, not what actually is. And so I think our optimism and our tendency to look at things very much as what could be, and if I just help, because we're nurturers too. And if I can just nurture this person to be the best version of themselves, this is what they can be. And so I think often that is our bias, is a bit optimistic and not fully practical and looking at what actually is.
So let's make that practical. So I'm dating someone who like is currently a really great guy. And this is a hypothetical. I'm not talking about my life right now. If I'm dating a guy that is awesome, has businesses, has a lot going for him, but maybe there's just some red flags of like some sly comments here and there, or like, how do we differentiate between wanting change just together, but accepting that person as they are right now, knowing that they fully might not ever change, and accepting them as they are?
Mm-hmm. Because, so I'll say two things about that. first is it is so important to find someone that you can dream with and build this vision that you have together. And so you do need to be hopeful. And
Mm.
at the same time, be aware so you can hold both realities at the same time. Be aware that when you are courting or dating or whatever word we call it these days, if
Right.
you're doing that, a person is typically on their best behavior as they pursue and try to secure the relationship.
Yes.
So if they are showing you things, and I'm a big believer also in letting people make mistakes and giving grace. When I get concerned are patterns where you've had to have a conversation about, let's say they're making, you said sly comments. And so let's say they've disrespected you and you've set a boundary and expressed yourself and they did it again and then again.
Sure.
That is a pattern. It's not a
Mhm.
one-off. And so I would tell you, let's look at their behavior now because they might grow, but they might grow in a different direction than what you think. So
Mm.
potential and looking at what could be is not always in your best interest.
Yeah, that's so good. And I mean, you you saw me do that plenty of times. I gave probably 7 last chances, probably more than that. So, okay, getting even more practical, I would say obviously going to counseling, having these people that speak into your life because we are always almost always wearing these rose-colored glasses that you want to believe the best in the person, and like I truly didn't realize how much I was not myself in my marriage until I exited it. And so knowing that I had counselors, people in my life that could speak into my life of saying like, Danielle, like what are you doing? Like, this is not, you are not being yourself. Why are you accepting this behavior? So, a massive thing that is going to help anybody in any of those situations is having those people around you that you have given permission to speak into your life, not people that you have not given permission
On
to
social media.
on social media. Exactly. So, that's a major factor of just checking and fine tuning relationships of you have to have people that speak in your life because you are going to be biased, whether it's towards yourself, towards your feelings for the other person. You have to have someone on the outside and that you have given permission to speak into your life.
And I call
Um,
that thinking with your heart and with your head. Right? Because the heart, that's where attachment and connection, and you let it get in the driver's seat. Sometimes that's important, but you also make sure because it right now has its permit. It doesn't have its
yeah.
license. So you want to make sure that your
Yes. That's so good.
head is in the passenger seat too. So you have to think with both.
Yeah. And that's, you just hit on one of my biggest pet peeves where people are like, follow your heart. It's like, no, ma'am. Your heart is deceitful above all things. Like, if you're making a decision, and I knew when I was making the decision about leaving my marriage, my heart wanted to stay with him because you've put in all this work. Like, obviously, you care about this person. But when your gut, like, you know the difference between your gut and your heart, when you have that deep feeling of this is not right for me. This is not what God has for me. This is not a situation I'm supposed to be in. But then your heart is turning you the other way. Like, that is such a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, 100%. Hey guys, before we continue on in the show, I wanted to ask, are you or a friend experiencing something like the stories you've heard? If so, Gina and I are excited to let you know we're offering group coaching for women so you can feel empowered, understood, valued, and worthy, even in the midst of confusion and pain. You don't have to go through this alone. We're providing exactly what we wish we would have had. Come experience a safe community of women that will help you grow, heal, and move forward. Not just to get by, but to walk confidently into freedom. There's limited space available, so for more information or to sign up, email us at hello@theunwedbride.com. Now let's get back to it. So I guess in my case of navigating singleness again, and I guess we kind of talked about this, but how can I learn to not make the same mistakes that might have gotten me here in the first place.
Right. So, a couple things that come to mind immediately are giving yourself time and really do a lot of self reflection and introspection. How do I show up in a relationship? Right. Because it's really, if you are in an unhealthy relationship, it's really easy to make it about this other person's behavior. But all relationships are co created and co
Mm,
constructed. So, you do need that period after leaving a relationship to really self reflect and take an inventory. When I become unhealthy or under stress or anxious or insecure, what are my patterns? What do I do? So that when you feel those instincts or urges coming because similar things are making you feel,
sure.
then you really have to kind of be aware of it first.
Yeah.
So, I think too, looking at what are your values? What are, because these relationships that we're in teach us a lesson if we're willing to really look at it and
Yeah.
see what it is God is trying to reveal to us.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe people come into our lives just randomly or for no reason. They are our greatest teachers, relationships are.
100%.
hmm So I think really allowing yourself, because I don't believe that you don't have the instinct or women's intuition. I think is so it's a thing.
It's powerful.
And what I find is you need to do more connecting with your intuition. But for whatever reason, sometimes we're in relationships where we're made to question ourselves about what is right, what feels good in having a partnership. And I would say, really just connect with your intuition as you move through the process and really have a select few, a very small circle of people who love you, who care about you, and ideally have healthy relationships themselves
Yeah.
to help you in the process, and really keeping that circle very small and leaning on them as you're kind of using them as a sounding board, right? As,
Yeah.
what do you think about this? And because you already have all the answers, you just don't always trust yourself to tap into your intuition.
Or want to believe them. So
hmm
like my example, I there were so many times that logic and evidence went completely against what I was being told. And it is that is such a hard balance because you want to believe the best in this person. This is your spouse, this is your significant other. You want to believe them, but with little things like that, don't make sense that I just chose
Discrepancies. hmm
yes, that I just chose to ignore because it wasn't worth the fight. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to acknowledge my marriage was over. All of these things, like you have to have that sounding board, especially when you're in a situation like mine, which thankfully is not everybody, but
hmm
it
and
is what it is.
and so too, like when you're immersed in something, you're not always able to see things objectively
Right.
because it's happening to you. You are in it, and people who are not in it can give you some perspective at times. So
Yeah.
it's really great to have people who you trust their intuition too.
Yeah. One of the things that you had said to me once was, if your sister was in this situation, what would you tell her to do? And I'm like, oh, I know I'd tell her to leave, but that's not me. Like, you have to think objectively and you have to have those people that are going to help you do that. You mentioned something about attachment versus connection. How do you distinguish between attachment versus connection or compatibility versus chemistry? Like, I would argue that some people can be incompatible. Doesn't mean they're supposed to be together. Obviously, chemistry is a very strong thing, but just because you have chemistry with somebody it also doesn't mean that. So, how do you balance like all of these things
Mhm.
and discerning between whether this person is worth pursuing or allowing to pursue me?
Yeah. So we actually all, there's a lot of research right now on attachment styles, and we all have an attachment style. I highly recommend finding yours out, and you can do a little research and test yourself. But
Yeah.
a lot of us don't have secure attachment styles, especially if you've experienced unhealthy relationships or the ending of a marriage. That can really make you a little bit anxious about
Right.
attaching to other people. So I would first recommend finding out what is my attachment style. Because if it's not secure, which a lot of us, I think about 40% of the population have a secure attachment style, lucky them. But the
Right.
other majority of people have either an insecure, anxious attachment style where they're kind of preoccupied with relationships. They struggle with clinginess or jealousy and insecurity. So that's one. And then there's also insecure avoidant people who
Mm.
are afraid of commitment and intimacy. So they sort of keep people at arm's length. They don't open up or disclose very much about themselves because they're afraid. So
Yeah.
it's anxiety on both sides, but how it manifests and presents looks different. So you got to know your attachment style, first of all. Connection to me is what you cultivate. Connection is
Okay.
something that you make an effort to create. So it's asking deep questions, it's holding space for people when they tell you really deep personal things. So the
Yeah.
connection piece is something you work hard to develop.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
For sure. So then how, for chemistry and compatibility, because compatibility especially, like if you have chemistry, whatever. For compatibility especially, you have the same moral beliefs, you have the same goals, your personalities line up really well. That doesn't always necessarily mean that you would be a great match together or that you should be together.
Mhm.
How would you navigate that?
I think compatibility and chemistry are both really important in relationships. Chemistry
Yeah.
is sort of, I think of it as a natural spark. I think about
Right.
chemistry. I hated that class in high school, but it's kind of just magnetic or
Right.
natural. So you don't have to work very hard at chemistry per se,
No.
but compatibility. A big thing I think about are, do your values align? Your beliefs on what's right and wrong, what's important to you, what guides your decisions. That to me is making sure that you have compatible visions. Do like what both of you want out of life. Do those things match? And compatibility, there's so many different factors, as you mentioned, things like your personality, your values, your worldview, your beliefs. Um, those things are really important, but I don't think you're going to find a partner who's going to agree and match up with you on every aspect. So the key, at least for me, is when you have differences, are you able to compromise or at least respect each other's differences,
Right.
and there's space for everyone's beliefs.
Right. So like the chemistry and the passion, it's kind of like a molding all of these things together. Like, okay, do we have a connection? Do we have chemistry? Are we compatible? And then it's kind of just like a let's try it. There's no formula for
Mhm.
knowing if I should date somebody, if I shouldn't. Like, you just kind of got to jump in,
Mhm.
right? Sometimes.
And I don't believe in, like the whole soulmate and there's a right person for everyone, because a perfect relationship doesn't exist. It's, you have to create that. You have to
Yes.
invest, put the effort in. So anybody could be your right partner, and you have to look at, am I a good partner?
Right.
So I think about creating a relationship. You can be as compatible as you want to be, but if you don't prioritize the relationship and if you're not committed and invested, it doesn't matter how compatible or strong the
Yes.
chemistry is.
Yes, 100%. And you just touched on something that I learned a few years ago when I was making a decision to either stay in North Carolina or move back home. And I was leaving a job. Still, there was this big, it was a decision I had to make. And one of the things that gave me permission was I was at a conference and I heard the guy talking say, sometimes God's will is just for you to choose. We have free will for a reason, right? And he gives us like brains to use and to think for ourselves. And there's so many times that like, well, I don't know if he's the one, right? But you're so right. Like if there was one person for everybody, all it takes is one person to step outside of God's will to screw up everybody else's relationship. Like if that was true, if there's only one person for everybody, and I step out of God's will and I marry your one person, then you're screwed. Then you're going to go marry somebody else's. Like it's not logical. It doesn't make sense. It drives me nuts. But that was one really big thing that I learned throughout my life is like, you know what? Sometimes God's will is just for you to choose. And it's true. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. Like if it's going to college, if it's dating this person or this person, like sometimes either one would work. God knows what you're going to choose, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. So when we talked about passion and for me navigating this like new season of singleness again, I was talking to my friend John the other day and he actually had a really, really great point. One of the least talked about things in Christian, post-divorce space is sexuality. And we get taught as kids and growing up our whole lives to wait until marriage and sex is bad outside of marriage and all these things. Then you get into marriage and sex is fair game. And then once like you can have it all you want, whenever you want, then once you're divorced, that is taken away, that permission, that like connection, all of that. But that doesn't mean that your desires or your cravings that you so got used to go away. So like how, and I mean, this is going to totally be a personal opinion. Like it's not like what you say is like, write it in stone, but how do you think, like, how would you go about navigating that? Like that's such something that is not talked about at all. But I think it's a really important conversation to have.
Mm-hmm. And I think the answer to that question will be very different based on whoever's answering it. Because I think that your own sexuality is such an individualized, personal journey. And I guess what I would offer are just some things to take into consideration when you are defining that for yourself. Because I think the reality is almost all human beings fall short of God's ideal of sexual ideal, like how it was defined and intended. We all fall short of it.
Yeah.
Because it is one of those things that I think is a gift from God, that it is so enjoyable and pleasurable, and it allows to bring beautiful things into the world, like children, and it creates connection and love. However, it is also, there's a dark side to human sexuality too. And it's sort of balancing, and your balance might be different than the next person's balance. So a guideline I sort of think of is, I think you really looking at, because I'm going to just say it, and this is a very blunt thing to say, but I've seen it a lot, is sometimes what creates marital problems are young, immature people in their late teens, early 20s wanting to jump into marriage because they want to have sex.
100%. Yes.
And I would much rather someone explore their sexuality, whether that looks like self-pleasure or however that looks, than to really change the whole trajectory of their lives because they want to have sex and they think the only okay way to do that is to be married. I will say that. And I will also say a guideline that I think is helpful is when you're exploring dating or maybe even kind of finding a partner, I think the degree of physical intimacy and connection should match the degree of emotional intimacy and connection. Like the two,
Mm,
I like to see, because some people do enjoy casual sex and it's not super meaningful, but if you are a Christian dating trying to find a partner, I would encourage you to really think about that for a second. Just that is the emotional connection and intimacy on the same level as the physical, emotional, and
that's such a good
mhm,
point. And that's such a good gauge for like if you're being balanced, if you are leading with sex just for attention versus like, are we actually connected? Are we compatible in this way? Like feeling that out. That is, that's such a great gauge.
mhm.
100%. I love that.
Yeah. And I always look too at, because sex does change a relationship. It adds and intensifies what's already there. So I would really encourage people to make conscious decisions and act always with intention and have a conversation about how sex will change the relationship too with
Yes.
the person. And
Yes.
if you guys can't talk about sex in a mature and open way, maybe you're not ready to have it.
Ooh, yes. That's so good. That is, that's so good.
Mhm.
I knew I brought you on here for a reason. Man, no, that's such a good point. I love that. And that would even beg the question of maybe maybe you're not ready for it, but maybe you're also not emotionally where you are supposed to be. Maybe your relationship is not emotionally where it's supposed to be. If you have sex and you can't talk about what happened, that's a red flag in that relationship. You don't feel safe, you don't feel protected, you don't feel open and honest. Like that's also an emotional red flag too.
Mhm. And I always think about ideally a relationship, a truly healthy and complete love looks like it's like a triangle, three sides, and you want to have equal parts passion. Super important. You want to
Yeah.
enjoy someone, and then
Yes.
also a friendship on the other side.
Mm.
And then at the foundation of it, the third side is the commitment. And so a really healthy relationship has a balance of all three.
Yeah, a healthy. Yeah, mine was not healthy.
Mhm.
So I'm not going to say what mine did or did not have.
Right. And sometimes one side of the triangle might look like it's a platonic relationship, right? You don't have the passion that you need for a partner for your life. And
Right.
then sometimes the person isn't committed. They're not in a space to commit to you. And that's not okay either.
Okay, so when we face like these tough things in relationships and identifying when to stay, when to leave. So when there's tough things in marriage obviously, but even just dating relationships, talk me through some of the signs or feelings of knowing when to stay versus when to leave, knowing if this is just the normal ups and downs and ebbs and flows of a relationship versus abuse emotionally any kind of way. How what are some talk me through how to know some of these signs of knowing versus when to stay and when to leave.
I have so many.
I'm here for it.
I'll
That's why
just
we're here.
I'll just pick some of the main ones. I think I always tell people that before you commit to someone, you should not pick a fight with them, but you should have conflict because
Yes.
you can get along really easily when you're not fighting about something or arguing, but to really see what comes out, I think you do have to have conflict. You have to disagree on something. And all conflict is a different perspective on something.
Yeah. Right.
And so if you can't navigate conflict in a healthy way, that is concerning. And when I say a healthy way, I mean, can you hear each other? Try to understand where the other person is coming from. Are they empathetic? Are they respectful when you set a boundary, or do they constantly push back on that? That's a
Mm.
problem. I think a big concern I always have when I'm counseling couples is if someone isn't able to take accountability, say they're sorry, admit they made a mistake, did something
Yes.
wrong, rather than be secretive or try to flip it. They get defensive and point out times when you made mistakes. That's a real issue because being able to take accountability, because if they can't, then everything's always going to be your fault.
Right.
And that's not reality. Not everything's your fault. And
No.
so if somebody can't take accountability, they can't grow. I think too, when you're expressing a concern or you are unhappy with something, if the person um, can't acknowledge your emotions, or if they dismiss you and say, well, you shouldn't be upset about that, or that's not what I meant, and there's never really an empathetic response or humility, I think that's a problem as well. Um, I would add to that, I think going back to the whole like you setting a boundary or saying something is important to you and pushing back on that or making you question yourself, those are things that are just not okay. They're never okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's, and so like knowing if you hear a lot of that and you hear like, you know, I think it took me a long time to, because abuse is such a strong word that obviously you don't mess around with. But I mean, it took your counsel and a lot of my own like self-reflection and growth to realize like I was 100% in an emotionally abusive and mentally abusive relationship. Like there were so many times that just the gaslighting or things that, I made excuses for. But if you are in an abusive relationship, you 100 marriage too, you have permission to separate. You have permission to divorce. That is one of the biblical grounds of divorce. There's abandonment, abuse, adultery, and those are biblical grounds for divorce. So if you are in that situation, you are allowed to leave, regardless of what you've been taught your whole life. Like, it's going to take you time to give yourself permission to do that. And I get that. But if you are in an unsafe situation, you need to go to a friend's house. You need to separate. You need to do something, but you need to step out of that situation immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you brought up so many good points today, and there is so much to digest. Before we close, do you have anything else that you want to add or any other little nuggets that you got for me?
I just want to echo a similar sentiment to what you just said, that I think we serve a kind God and a God
Yes.
that wants us to be the best versions of ourselves. And if you are in a relationship that brings out unhealthy qualities in you regularly, that is not what God intends for you. And
Yes.
also, I think sometimes in a relationship, when you're fighting so hard to make it healthy, you're actually putting that person, your partner, above God. And it makes you
Mm,
lose focus and lose sight of who you are as a Christian and as a follower. And you just become so consumed with being a wife or a partner that you aren't growing spiritually because all your energy is being invested in trying to salvage something that isn't salvageable.
100%. That is not God's heart for you, is not to stay in this marriage that, or in this relationship that is, number one, not glorifying to him. Like I was so concerned about breaking this covenant with God, but I would argue that maybe it wasn't a covenant from the beginning. Maybe it wasn't even blessed from the beginning. Like, and I don't know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'm still processing that. But if getting married in the first place was a mistake, then I would argue that it might not be a covenant at all. So that is one thing that I had to learn. But yeah, so many so many good points. God's heart for you is not to stay in a situation that is constantly tearing you down, constantly pulling you away from the person that he created you to be. Since I left my marriage, you know, there's so many things that are like, I'm passionate again. My personality is coming alive again. There's so many things that I'm realizing were suppressed for so long because that is not what God had for me. And so I'm telling you, the freedom that you experience of just letting go and letting God, I know it's hard and I know it's cliche, but there really is so much freedom in that. And you will be so glad and thankful that you did, although it might hurt, although it might be a process. The process is so worth it, and you have to trust that process.
Amen.
So much to digest, but thank you so much again, Dr. Jamie, for joining us today. You do continue to impact so many lives, mine included, and I'm really, really blessed to have you in my life.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can find us on all social platforms at the Unwed Bride. And for exclusive content, head on over to the Patreon link in the description. See you next time.